I'm Mark Blackburn, sitting in for Sierra Battens. Welcome to APTN News InFocus. In this episode, living next to industry in what are called sacrifice zones. Most of us have seen them and even smelt them. Those refineries or factories along the highways or roadways that come and go throughout our travels. They produce the products we use every day. We usually don't even give them a second thought. But for some, living next to industry isn't taken for granted. It can be a lifetime of warnings because of chemical leaks or odors that keep you indoors on a warm summer day. Some call these areas, these lines between industry and land where we live, sacrifice zones. And that's the subject of an APTN Investigates documentary by Belleau and Tom Fennario.
Every minute, 1 million plastic bottles are purchased globally. Bottles that will further poison oceans, ecosystems, and bodies. Microplastics have been found in the placentas of healthy women. Think about that for a minute. We are literally raising a generation that starts its life polluted before taking...
That's the opening sequence to Sacrifice Zones, and Angela and Tom join me now. Hello.
Hi, Mark.
Hi, Mark.
Angela, I'll start with you. What first introduced you to sacrifice zones and wanting to put a documentary together?
Yeah, the concept actually came from just my experience meeting some youth who were actually doing some contamination projects. So they were looking at PFAS, which are polyfluoroalkyl alkyl substances. So they're just contaminants that end up in the environment and end up in fish. And part of that research that they were doing or looking at was microplastics. So it stemmed from there and kind of spiraled into something a lot bigger than I expected, which a lot of people that I talked to pointed towards Aamjiwnaang First Nation as a place that Tom and I should go visit and report from. So that sort of is where we ended up, because when you think about microplastics, you kind of think about like what they are and where they come from. And so going to point of production, which is where Aamjiwnaang First Nation is, and going there to really get a full grasp of it is kind of the reason why we went there and did this.
APTN followers are definitely familiar with that community. But before we get there, your story deals with microplastics, as you just said. But like, what is the link between these sacrifice zones and these microplastics that you're talking about?
Yeah, like I mentioned, like first starting with what microplastics are and where they come from. And microplastics are basically just smaller pieces of plastic that break down and don't biodegrade over time. So when you go back through the life cycle of plastics and go from, the products that you have in front of you to how they're actually produced, going to these places called sacrifice zones where industry are and exist close to communities like Aamjiwnaang, it offers some sort of insight into like what sort of environmental contamination happens in those areas, not just based around microplastics, but also the other environmental pollutions that come from industry itself, whether that be like air pollution, water pollution, just contaminants that end up in the soil and the environment. Microplastics will end up everywhere, but understanding how they become is actually a critical part to the story.
Now, Tom, you visited Aamjiwnaang First Nation. You describe it for us.
So Aamjiwnaang First Nation is a Chippewa First Nation just south of Sarnia, Ontario, where you have all of this petrochemical industry. And I guess the main link there is that plastics, people don't always know this, actually start as petrochemicals. They come from fossil fuels. And the thing about Aamjiwnaang, I guess I would describe it as a very welcoming community. I think about 900 people live there, but they have more members spread out all across. And they're kind of just like, they're totally surrounded by industry. Sometimes it feels a little bit like Mordor over there, right? Like you have all of these, for you Lord of the Rings fans, you have all of these smokestacks around them. I wouldn't call them smokestacks. They have like flaring at the top. So it's like a pilot light on your gas stove is the best way to describe it, right? So you have these little fires coming out of like chimneys that sort of help prevent gas explosions, right? It helps burn them off. And so it just sort of has like a very like eerie feeling around there sometimes. But at the same time, I don't want to do it too much injustice because it's right next to the St. Clair River. It's like the bluest water I've ever seen in my entire life. It's very beautiful. one of the last untouched forests for like something like 40 kilometers. And they still, have their traditional practices in there. And they still use the land, right? And it's like this little like safeguarded area, and they're just sort of trying to like they're just holding back this encroaching industry. But the thing that you can't hold back, unfortunately, is air pollution.
And anybody who wants to see a picture of that forest can go to APTN News online and check out your web story and watch your story. There's a very telling shot of the forest with the refinery in the background. The community has been living in the shadow of refineries, for decades? Like, when did this all start?
In the 40s, around World War II, just towards the end of World War II. I guess fossil fuels were discovered in the southern Ontario area, and this Crown Corporation started making rubber in the area, and from there all this industry grew. I think that back then I was thinking it was much easier to infringe upon First Nations rights, and I think it's safe to say that Aamjiwnaang First Nations ancestral territory was infringed upon greatly in the mid-20th century to the late 20th century. And I will say this about Aamjiwnaang. I think one thing that's a bit encouraging about the story is they've really taken matters into their own hands in terms of now they measure their own air quality. They're able to like hold industry to account more when things go wrong. I should say this, people we spoke to say industry does a much better job now. Although they did have a very scary air quality issue just last week where folks had to be evacuated from their homes. So even though things have gotten better, that's only in comparison, it would seem, to the awful days of the mid-20th century where people just ran roughshod over their ancestral territory. So Aamjiwnaang, to their credit, has taken it into their hands to sort of push back and keep track of things on their own end. But man, it's like you're surrounded by this I'm not sure how much money, but lots of money is made there, and it's hard to always push back against these powers that be, right? So. Good on Aamjiwnaang for holding up the fort. Well,
Angela, as Tom says, things are probably better than they were when refineries opened up during World War II. But has there been progress on regulations that actually make it safer to be around them?
Yeah, Tom kind of touched on this a little bit, but I think the one thing that comes to mind was when they declared the state of emergency last year, it actually prompted a change in the benzene emission standards. And the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks, which is the Ontario Ministry, they had changed the regulation for benzene emissions to a different standard. So they were recording, I think it was like 90 micrograms per meter cubed is the new standard. And what this did for the community was just allow them to report on things a little bit sooner than them being worse. They've also set their own standards. It's interesting because their standard is 27 micrograms per meter squared, which is a lot different than the one set by the ministry. So when it comes to community safety, they have a different sort of perspective on what that looks like based on their standards for benzene emissions. But this is just one chemical, right? Like there's these industries that surround them that are releasing things like SO2s, particulate matter. I mean, there's so many other different contaminants that are being released into the environment, and those emission standards haven't changed as drastically as the ones for benzene have. Another thing that comes to mind when talking about those emission standards was that Aamjiwnaang First Nation and Environment and Climate Change Canada signed an agreement to address industrial pollution through a joint committee. And this was sort of prompted by Bill C-226. And it was just to create their plans to create a national strategy to combat environmental racism that the community is currently experiencing. And this will allow Aamjiwnaang to pilot their own projects to look at this, which could be useful for other communities who are facing the sort of same issues that Aamjiwnaang is facing right now. But still, I think there's still so much work that needs to be done when it comes to regulation. And when we talk about plastics, for example, I mean, emissions are just one part of it, but then we're looking at the actual waste management of these plastics and the current regulations for single plastic use bans or listing plastics under SEPA as a toxic substance. Those are still, kind of contentious a little bit. It seems when it comes to industry and their role in plastic creation, and it's funny because when you think about plastic, it's such a big thing, and when it comes down to it, there's a lot of little things.
Tom, you have a clip here you want to play for us. Can you set it up?
Yeah, so we've been talking a lot about Aamjiwnaang First Nation for good reason, but we spoke to lots of other folks for this story. And one of the main characters is Lynn Jacobs, who is a Kahnawake woman, also known as Mohawk, from Kahnawake, just south of Montreal. And she's doing her PhD study in the life cycle of plastics. And so not only was she able to give us sort of a science perspective, but also an Indigenous perspective.
Plastics are not biodegradable. They break down into pieces smaller and smaller and smaller. And all of those plastics have chemicals as well. It has, basically colonized the entire planet, the microplastics, and it has turned all of us into sacrifice zones.
That was Lynn Jacobs, who lives in Kahnawake, right, Angela?
Yeah, it was really cool to be able to go and meet her because we first met her at her house, which is very sustainably built. She has her little homestead with goats and chickens and ducks, and we got to meet some of them. But, she spoke to us a little bit about recycling and waste management and was able to take us on a drive not too far from her home. I think it was maybe a minute or two. And she kind of just showed us the boundary line from, on one side there's forest and their survival school, which is their high school there. And on the opposite side is the waste management facilities. And what they do is they recycle plastic battery casings. And we couldn't really get a good view of it. But what I did manage to see was a pile of material that looked like synthetics from cars, because I think they also recycle parts of cars as well. So whether that be seats, because when we think about automobiles, there's also plastics that are used to build the different components that make up a car. It was sort of like a striking sort of juxtaposition, being able to see, forest on one side and recycling on the other. And you see all these other cars driving through the community as well, whether they're big oil or gas trucks driving through. But that's one of her study sites for her PhD, actually, is looking at Kahnawake as a fence-line community.
Microplastics have actually been in the news, I guess, in the last year, the beginning of the consciousness of realizing what these microplastics are doing. And they're finding it in the Arctic, finding it in fish. As you mentioned, Angela, it's been before the United Nations. What comes next for this?
I think there's been a lot of momentum building up to the next negotiations, which are going to be happening August 5th to the 14th of this year. And one group who's going to be observing as part of this is the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Plastic, which Lynn Jacobs, Janelle Namaben, who is the chief of Aamjiwnaang, and CJ Smith-White, they are part of this group, and they're working alongside a lot of other Indigenous people from all over the world. And their goal is just to ensure that Indigenous rights are being upheld when the treaty negotiations are happening, and that the text is reflective of these Indigenous rights and the knowledge is from the communities that are experiencing firsthand the impacts of plastic pollution. So it'll be interesting to see what happens after August 14th and during the negotiations, what comes out of it.
And I want to thank you both for the work you put into the story. But before I let you go, I'm going to put you on the spot. Tom, I'll start with you. The world is focused on the economy right now. There's just no doubt about it. And it's not about the environment. So what do you think that means in terms of this issue?
That's tough, right? Because at the end of the day, people need to make a livelihood. I don't pretend to have all the solutions, Mark, but one part of that our story does touch on is the idea of possible solutions. And I don't want to be like a snake oil salesman and this isn't going to fix everything, right? But there are certain technologies that allow us to make biodegradable plastics, because let's be honest, plastics are an important part of the modern existence of our modern life, and the main problem of plastic is the single-use kind, right? So if we can minimize our single-use plastics, either ideally by reducing is the main takeaway from the story, but also there could be maybe some solutions involving biodegradable plastics being used more. We maybe need to adapt our recycling systems and our composting systems to better handle biodegradable plastics. But the technology does exist to make single-use plastic less bad for the environment for those items that are incredibly hard to reduce. That would be sort of the kind of positive takeaway that maybe doesn't hurt the economy of things so much.
Right. Yeah, because it's all going to be about money. Angela, any thoughts?
the takeaway that I got from this story was that there's opportunities for Indigenous people to kind of step into these roles as stewards. And when it comes to the environment, there's opportunities that exist for them to be able to look at those solutions and, maybe make a kind of blend between environment and economy as well. Like, you have this environmental perspective, and how can that reshape the economy? I don't know what that would look like necessarily, but it would be interesting to see after this, more people who are aware of plastic pollution and gain a better sense of the issues that stem from it, step into these sorts of spaces where they bring this environmental lens to reshaping the economy. But then again, there's issues with Bill C5 with opening up Ontario for industry to do more things. And I think that there's focus on that currently, but maybe that's a way for them to actually be able to do something a little bit differently as well.
Angela and Tom, thank you very much for this.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Appreciate it.
You'll find APTN Investigates Sacrifice Zones on aptnnews.ca or on our YouTube channel. This episode of In Focus was produced by Charmaine Straker, with editing by Jesse Andrushko. If you're enjoying the show, let us know by leaving a rating and a review. And you can find more APTN podcasts like APTN News Brief and Truth in Politics on aptnnews.ca/podcast or on your favorite player. If you want to comment on anything you've heard on the show, drop us a line at infocus@aptnnews.ca. We promise we'll respond. APTN News is a not-for-profit news agency, and if you'd like to contribute to its operations and allow our reporters to continue to tell stories, please go to our website and hit the contribute button. Thanks for listening.
APTN presents a captivating journey into the heart of the North with our latest podcast, The Place That Thaws.
Some areas that used to be safe are no longer safe.
Hosted by me, Danielle Parody. Join us as we uncover the intricacies of life on a changing coast. Subscribe and listen to The Place That Thaws.